Greetings and welcome. My name is Don Alexander. I'm President and Managing Director of GeneCoda Executive and Professional Search. We connect outstanding firms in the life sciences sector with executives who help bring game-changing products to the market. I'm pleased to be joined here today with Barry Buzogany, an advisory board member of our firm. Barry is a professional board director and former C-suite executive for both public and private pharmaceutical, life sciences, med tech, and contract research organizations. Barry is currently serving as director on select advisory and statutory boards to share his wealth of leadership experiences, extensive domain knowledge, and lessons learned as an accomplished operations and legal executive and entrepreneur. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Barry. In this video series, Barry and I will be discussing the functions of corporate and advisory boards, including the legal and practical differences and pros and cons of each, why consider a board of directors or advisory board, and when is the right time, how to form a board and criteria for selecting board members, and how to compensate board members of the board of directors or advisory board. So in this video, we'll discuss why to form a board of directors or advisory board and when is the right time to do so. Question for you, Barry. A board of directors is required by law for incorporated companies, but why form an advisory board?
Okay, good question. Yes, indeed, the board of directors for an incorporated company is, in terms of how that's done and why it's done, is set forth in the state statutes. But an advisory board, you'll recall from our previous video, is totally discretionary, and so that is up to the CEO in terms of whether and why he should do so, he or she. And I give a couple points on that I think are pertinent. One, I would look back to the advantages of having an advisory board in the first place, because if the CEO realizes that, then that certainly goes a long way to answering his own question to himself about why form. Again, it has to do with the fact that the CEO realizes, hopefully, that he doesn't know everything he or his staff or his senior team need to know when it comes to starting, running, and being a successful business. They need to pull in other people that have subject matter expertise, and can do so by forming an advisory board. And there are a lot of advantages to doing that we covered the last time. It's discretionary, it's informal, it's one-on-one kind of advice you can get, and even though they have no decision-making authority, there's an important point to be made about their value in addition just to the advice and guidance that they give to the CEO and his team. That being, if you form a company and an advisory board around it with people that are well-known, experts in the field, that have prominent roles in society, or again are thought leaders out there in your industry or in your science or related in some way to your company, that adds a great deal of credibility to your company. And companies that are not yet public and maybe earlier stage, that's very important, especially if they're pre-money. Or they're going to be going out for another round, to have on your slides and have it be known that you have a team of people around you as advisors who, again, are thought leaders out there, and that can be very important and very helpful to you to have such prominent people. A scientific advisory board is a good example for a life sciences company. Certainly, if you have, let's say, the right people on that SAB, again, that are known out there in the industry or in the space, whether they be medical, financial, clinical, could go a long way in terms of ultimately the success of your company and the recognition by the general public of your company. So, and again, no regular meetings, less structured. So it's a good reason to form. The other reason has to do more maybe existential. It has to do perhaps with the life cycle of the company. Now, you certainly can have an advisory board, whether it's a startup or whether it's a public company, but there are times during the course of the maturation of a company where the life cycle might dictate a greater advantage at that moment than others to have an advisory board. For example, your company may be scaling up at this point in time. You may suddenly find a competitive threat out there that wasn't there previously. For other reasons, you might be making a strategic pivot with your business model. You might be going out for a round of funding. You might plan to be going public in the near term. So those are all kinds of pivot points where if you don't already have an advisory board, it makes sense perhaps to bring folks into your advisory board for that reason, based on the life cycle of the company. And finally, there's one I'll touch on a little more later, is that the third reason might be because you already have a statutory board, and they've told you, the CEO, they want an advisory board. So they're requiring that. So those are some of the reasons why I think it's something that a CEO ought to give a lot of thought to in terms of making use of and taking advantage of advisors that are out there for typically for equity. That's the other thing. If you don't have a budget, if you're an early stage company and you can't afford to pay consultants and you don't have a board yet, man, advisors are out there who would love to buy into what you're doing. If they have faith in what you are doing as a company, would probably love to be an advisor to you if they have that expertise you need. And typically they only require a little bit of stock options.
That's a really great overview, because one of the thoughts I had was around the idea of the timing of, or the right time, I guess, to form an advisory board. And it sounds like it really, from your description, Barry, it sounds like that's really codependent on perhaps different milestones and, the nature, I guess, of the company itself. Did I understand that correctly?
No, that's right. In fact, in our first video, we talked about how it can really vary. The points I'm making can vary and can depend on a lot of things. And that's certainly some of those things that come into play with respect to an advisory board versus a corporate board and so forth. And as far as when the right time is, that too can depend on a couple of things. One, as I mentioned a moment ago, if you have a corporate board, they may decide that it's time for you to have an advisory board. Why? Well, one of the typical reasons is your corporate board is made up of investors. So if they're not on the board, if you have major shareholders out there who want to be represented, so to speak, in your management of the day-to-day business, they would want to have an advisor representing them on an advisory board. And sometimes you'll have a board of director who, because he's representing an investor, but he may not have the expertise he needs. And so they might want advisors around you that really can work with your team on a day-to-day basis, which your corporate board folks do not do.
Gotcha.
So I was thinking that so the life cycle can certainly come into play. And I thought that obviously the CEO has to have recognition too of a need and a deficit in the expertise within the company itself. And so the right time is when he or she realizes that, it's time to bring, whether it's one person, two people, six people on as advisors. That's something that they should recognize at the right time. And I wanted to compare, if I could, the difference between having an advisor versus a consultant, because a lot of people would ask that question. Why don't I just hire a consultant? Well, that's a good question, because typically you will, as a company, whether you have a corporate board or you don't, you're probably going to need a lawyer. You're probably going to need a finance person. And if you don't have those people on board, those are typically consultants, right? They work for a fee. And so that's one difference. Obviously, you can bring an advisor in who is on your advisory board, again, who's not acting in a professional capacity as far as charging you for his or her time. He's there, again, exchange for stock options. So consultants are people with a more finite role. Oftentimes it's project-based, so that it's, a near-term kind of activity for you. And so it might have a project focus. It could be, as I say, an FDA regulatory affairs person who is out there consulting to life sciences companies. That person's going to be a consultant rather than on your advisory board. So I wanted to make that distinction, because those two concepts can be confused.
That's great. That's great. So maybe if you can touch on also the number of people on the board of directors rather, and the and or the advisory board, and obviously those can be changed. To what degree should they? Maybe how frequently should those changes be looked at? Do you think?
Okay. Well, the in the case of a statutory board or a fiduciary board, those are interchangeable terms. You'll recall that those are driven by state law, and they're also driven then by the bylaws that are required for a board of directors to for a company, I should say, to put into place, and that those bylaws will speak to a board of directors and how many board members, for example. So if that were to you wanted that to change, if your board, your chairman wanted that to change, then they simply have to vote on a change to the bylaws if in fact they already have met the limit, so to speak, that's in your current bylaws. Oftentimes you'll put in there a number 5 to 7 or whatever, maybe you only have 4 at the time. So adding another board member at that point is just a vote of the board. Majority of vote says that we need to bring on another board member. It's not as complicated, so to speak, for an advisory board in terms of the number. That's totally up to the CEO in terms of how many he or she thinks they need. And if you want to increase or decrease, it's just a matter of, if you have an advisory board agreement in place with some advisors, you can terminate that agreement if you want to, if that person's services are no longer needed, or otherwise you can enter into a new agreement with a different person and add as many as you want. Some nonprofits and other such, they can have 20 advisors. Other companies will have 1 or 2. So that can really vary. But and some advisory boards will have a charter too. There is a formality that one can have as an advisory board in putting a charter together, and that will speak to as well as how many advisors you should have on the team.
Great. Um, we hear a lot about board observers. I wonder if you could talk to us about your thoughts regarding board observers.
Yeah, board observers are kind of a strange mix of person, because they're not an advisory board person. They're not a statutory board person, and yet they have a right to sit on the board meetings. Well, how does that happen? It happens typically in the environment where your company is post money, has investors. Those investors, some of whom are probably on the board, may want a board observer to sit in on your board. On your board meetings, because they themselves, let's say a principal investor, may or may not be on the board or have a representative on the board. But even if he or she does, they still may want a board observer. For example, again, you have an investor who has a representative on the board, but they're not steeped in the science of the company's business. So maybe they will in turn bring a board observer on who is steeped in the science and can translate and interpret for that investor's board member and for the investor himself. So, but again, they have no vote. They have no decision-making authority. They're strictly there as observers. And in some cases, the board can decide on the rules of the game, so to speak, for the observer. They may have limited opportunity to speak. In other words, they set up ground rules for the board observer's conduct in those meetings. And again, you'll typically find a board observer in an environment where there are investors, typically major investors in the company. I had an interesting experience some years ago when I was on a board with respect to board observers, in that I was joining a board that for some years prior already was pretty dysfunctional. And one of the reasons was they had a board member who was also a founder and an original investor in the company, who was creating a lot of discord during board meetings, and it became a problem such that we decided, because he was an investor and an original member, that we would make him a board observer, so that he no longer had the authority of a board member, but he could be present at the meetings and could participate. We didn't set any strict rules on his participation. We wanted his opinion. But again, it sort of took away any authority he might have to vote or make decisions. So that was kind of an interesting situation we had at that time.
Well, that's great, Barry. Really appreciate your guidance on these questions here today. Our next video in this series will cover how to form a board and the selection criterion for doing so.